Hi, Marc Conner. How are you?
Hello,
it's a pleasure.
Mark.
Yes, I've heard good things about you.
I'm glad to have your name at last. I've seen you around. We've howdied, but we ain't shook. I'm glad of that. But for our vast audience out there in television land, I'm happy to welcome to our Alumni College on Benjamin Franklin, Marc Conner, who is the university provost. He's the top academic officer. He's also the Jim and Joe Ballengee Professor of English. For us, those names mean a great deal because Jim Ballengee, who was for many years the rector of the university's Board of Trustees, and his wife, Joe, both of them are departed by now, but they were great friends of the Alumni College, as well as wonderful representatives of all that is good about Washington and Lee. It is so appropriate that the chair that they've given to the university goes to the man who has done more for Alumni College and lifelong learning at Washington and Lee than any other academician here. So Marc, thank you again for your presence in this program. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Great to see such a packed house. Very encouraging, and delighted to see everybody here. I'm so appreciative that Rob mentioned the Ballengees. I got to meet Jim Ballengee, who of course is a legend at W&L and was rector during the great transformation of coeducation. I met him in the late 90s when he was attending alumni colleges when I first started to lecture in the Alumni College, and the privilege and honor of meeting Jim and Joe was profound, and always grateful to Rob and the Alumni College for making that possible. So I'm delighted to be here today. As I indicated last night, I'm going to be talking about Benjamin Franklin in the context of American literature, which is, I think, the most capacious context for speaking about Franklin's work. I want to talk about him as an American writer, as an American intellectual. I want to talk about the intellectual history that surrounds Franklin, and I want to talk in particular about the ways Franklin helps us define what I would call the American character, and talk a little bit about Franklin both then and now, and his influence on American literature, which I, as I said last night, in my teaching of American writers, I have found his influence is profound. I think in some ways more profound than has long been recognized. And I start with this quote from Crevecoeur: "What then is the American, this new man? The American is new, and it's being created during Franklin's own lifetime. And we are the beneficiaries of that creation, as well as tasked with the challenge of that creation. It is a blessing and a curse in many ways." So I want to start with Franklin in his time, Franklin and the 18th century, and in particular the American 18th century. Franklin is a man of the 18th century, born in 1706, dies in 1790. He spans the century, and in many ways is definitive of the 18th century. And yet he's born barely 10 years after the Salem witch trials. Yet he dies within a decade or so of the Louisiana Purchase and the astonishing expansion of the American border. So he's caught between these seismic events in American culture. So what does it mean to be a man of the 18th century? Well, I want to start by thinking about the British tradition and context of the 18th century, because that is certainly the way Franklin thought of himself for at least the first half of his life and perhaps beyond, as a man living in the British tradition and context. So the British 18th century is, and I'm speaking in generalities here, but it's a shift from great instability, particularly the instability of the 17th century, to a period of stability. Moving away from Cromwell and the Puritan Revolution and the Stuarts to William and Mary, the Hanoverians, and the long reign of the Georges that would go all the way to 1830. It's a period of many changes, including the rise of the essay in the newspaper, Addison and Steele, the Spectator, the Tatler. These are things that lead to the kind of writing and the kind of work, including the printing press work, that was so important to Benjamin Franklin. It's the period of the Act of Union of 1707 and the less formal but imposed union between what would become Great Britain and Ireland during this time. A time, as I said, of relative stability and peace. This is the Georgian age, the Augustan age, harking back to the reign of Caesar Augustus, the neoclassical models of order and stability and decorum. These classical models and these ideas of nature and of wit. It's when the English canon really gets created in terms of literature. British poetry at this time is highly complex, learned, elaborate poetry. It's also the time of the rise of the novel, that quintessential 18th century form, the only literary form to be invented in the modern age. The novel is really a child of the 18th century. And the novel, of course, seeks to capture real life, the life of ordinary people in many respects, to pick up on some of the points that Turk was making yesterday about ordinary lives during this period. The novel is the great democratic form in many respects. And of course, it's the era of the rise of science, the flourishing of Newton, the expansion of the Royal Society, all of which Benjamin Franklin was a key figure in. And this, of course, is the time of Great Britain, the expansion of the greatest empire the world had known since the Romans. And a shift, we might say, really from a medieval to a modern worldview. If we were plunked down in England in the 17th century, I think it would look quite strange to us. England in the 18th century, we would recognize some things. It looks more like the modern world that we have inherited and less like the medieval world that preceded it. So that's interesting to me. What does it mean to think about Franklin in that context and the American 18th century? How well does the American 18th century map onto the British 18th century? Well, I talked a little bit about some commonalities a moment ago, but there, of course, are some key differences. America is not, for America, it's not the century of monarchy and the growth of empire, but of revolution and a new concept of government. American literature is not elaborate and learned, but rough and romantic. The next generation would yield Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper, these first great chroniclers of the American landscape, which is so different from the British landscape that greeted so many English authors. Of course, it's not the expansion of the British Empire, but the first breaking away from that empire and sowing the seeds of the next great world empire, the American empire of the 20th and 21st centuries. And then here is Franklin in the midst of this, straddling these two great traditions, the man of science, of reason, of experimentation, and himself as responsible as anyone for moving the Western world further towards the modern age. We will see in Franklin a quintessential 18th century man, but with that essential American difference. So let's talk a bit about the world from which Franklin emerged. Say a little bit about that Puritan worldview. Because part of what makes Franklin so remarkable is the world from which he came. I've already mentioned his overlap with the Salem witch trials, that grim culmination of the great American Puritan project. American cultural history begins with the Puritan experiment, that daunting effort to escape old world Europe and all its corruptions, and to found in the so-called New World a pure, pristine, just, indeed unfallen world that would return us to the Edenic state from which we have fallen. And when John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Company, was sailing to New England in 1630, on board the ship, he delivered his famous sermon, A Model of Christian Charity. And here he declared of his fellow Puritans, "We shall be as a city upon a hill," echoing Matthew's gospel. And that Puritan mission was to form a community that would return to God's chosen people, like the Hebrews from the Old Testament covenant, Winthrop said, "Thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into covenant with Him for this work. We have taken out a commission. The Lord hath given us leave to draw our own articles." I just love that Puritan metaphor. Like there's a sort of businessman's handshake with God. Here's what we're going to do. Let us write it out in plain verse. For the Puritans, the New World experiment was an opportunity to get right what humanity had for its entire history gotten so wrong. And the boldness, the brio, the pridefulness of that project needs to be understood because it infects and informs the American project to this day. Theirs was a vision of theocracy and a sense of special purpose and mission. And as we read in American literature in the centuries to follow, in many respects this sense of special purpose persists. We might think of the final vision of Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, published in 1925. This is from the last page, when Nick Carraway reflects at the end of that book. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy, moving glow of a ferry boat across the Sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. That is such a great passage from such a great book. Every day should start with a passage from The Great Gatsby. I mean, that's just the way to get your day going. That passage is not able to be comprehended without understanding the Puritan mission that founded the formal America. Even that ferry boat across the Sound is emblematic of that movement of peoples from the old world to the new world. That old island that flowered once, that fresh green breast of the new world, this fount of plenty, this Edenic vision. And Fitzgerald, through Carraway, realizing that the dream was impossible even as the dream was first articulated, which of course is the essence of The Great Gatsby. And yet still, that admiring note, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his, that is humanity's, capacity for wonder. That's the American project from its founding, and we're still living in that project to this day. This Puritan vision is crucial to understand historical traumas like the Salem witch trials, that last-ditch effort to reassert the primacy of their sacred vision and to claim the authority of their theological worldview, while all around them that world was changing, and the failure of their effort to attain the new Jerusalem in the earthly realm was becoming more and more evident. Now we think of Benjamin Franklin as the very opposite of this Puritan worldview. Far from seeking a theocracy, Franklin would be among the key proponents of a secular government, making that cleavage between church and state. And Franklin's religious worldview, though a complex matter, hardly resembles the dogmatic Puritan focus on salvation, damnation, the elect, the preterite, and a concept of moral purity. Yet it's during Franklin's early adult years that the Puritan impulse rears its head again with a new ferocity in the Great Awakening of 1734 to 49. When a spirit of religious revivalism would sweep the eastern seaboard, and he writes at length about this in part 3 of the Autobiography. To give you just a final flavor of this Puritan worldview, I'll just share with you an outline of Jonathan Edwards' magnificent sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which he delivered not in 1641, as it might sound, but in 1741, right in the midst of Franklin's own lifetime. And this is a classic example of the Puritan Jeremiah, the Sermon of Denunciation. God has complete power to cast you into hell. You deserve to be cast into hell. You are already condemned to hell. God's wrath is already focused on you. The devil is ready to fall upon you. You belong to him. You have reason to wonder that you are not already in hell. Nothing you can do can prevent this. Only Christ's mercy can avail. This is marvelous stuff. This is an eminently teachable sermon in the 21st century. And I have had students come to my office disturbed by this sermon, much as they do from the sermon on hell in Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. This persists, of course, today in the Christian fundamentalist tradition, in the enthusiastic strains of Christianity, and also in that near evangelical fervor with which Americans approach their political and cultural beliefs, regardless of where they are on our political spectrum. We see this fervor and enthusiasm, for example, in the Civil War rhetoric, both in the 19th century and in 2018. We see it in the concepts of manifest destiny and a special purpose to the American enterprise, and in the peculiar manifestations of intolerance that mark American history. And Arthur Miller's brilliant comparison of the Salem witch trials to the McCarthy hearings a half a century ago shows the persistence of the Puritan worldview in the American consciousness. Now again, we think of Franklin as being so the opposite of this sort of non-rational, fervent emotionalism and the conviction of a punishing God and a fallen humanity. But think about things in the autobiography like the great ethical project and the constant examination of conscience. When we think about some of the errata that Franklin says early on he wants to correct, his break with his brother, his being less than faithful with Vernon's money, his father's disappointment in him, his unfair dealings with Miss Reed, some sexual dalliances with married and unmarried women. With a nudge, these become the litany of sins that the Puritans condemn. Failure to be loyal, family dissension, lack of respect for the father, lust and fornication, all conveyed in Franklin's semi-humorous style, of course. But the point I want to make is that the apparent distance between Franklin's worldview and the Puritan view that preceded him is less vast than we might at first think. And this is true of American literature in general. One great example of this is Henry Thoreau and the great Walden Project. What could be less puritanical than, going out into nature and planting beans and wrestling with the natural world? Well, if you want a voice of intolerance and purity, go to the middle parts of Thoreau's Walden, and you will see there a puritanical vision that I always find somewhat disturbing. Americans are less willing to let go of purity than we might suspect. And I think this is true even of Benjamin Franklin. Think about his great claim. It was about this time that I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. I wished to live without committing any fault at any time. I would conquer all that either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into. Whoa. That is the Puritan impulse par excellence, an individual version of the community effort to establish the New Jerusalem, to go back to the prelapsarian state, to accomplish what Christian theology itself teaches only Jesus Christ was able to do. And then he's got that great part at the end, imitate Jesus and Socrates. Immensely prideful. True, Franklin seasons it with humor and apparent modesty. He writes, "But I soon found I'd undertaken a task of more difficulty than I had imagined. I love that moment. This is going to be kind of difficult, actually. Maybe there's a reason no one's been able to do this before. And, quote, I was surprised to find myself so much fuller of faults than I had imagined. That's actually anti-Puritanical. The Puritan would say, I knew all along I was full of faults. The point, of course, is that the Puritan impulse is never far from the American spirit. Now, I'm going to explore the moral perfection project further in my lecture tomorrow. But this is a good segue into thinking about the entire project of Franklin's autobiography, which is a very paradoxical book. Like most American books, it is highly paradoxical. The Great Gatsby, of course, is really about the failure and inadequacy of the very fallible J. Gatsby. Moby Dick is about many things. It's not really about the white whale of its title. Huckleberry Finn poses as a children's book and lures us in through that masquerade, but it's actually one of the most challenging books for grown-ups in the entire American canon. And we could go on at some length about the marvelous paradoxes of American literature. But turning now to the autobiography itself, I'll read a few passages here and there. My own copy is so marked up I have to turn to that, or I'll feel like I'm reading a different book altogether. But I'll try to indicate where we are in the Dover edition that we provided for you. So here's the question: what does the autobiography itself claim to be? What does any autobiography claim to be? It claims to be the telling of the self's own story. Telling one's own life story, there is always a prideful effort in writing an autobiography. I mean, you got to think sort of highly of your life if you think it is worth people buying, reading, studying, spending time in. There's a sense of self-importance to the autobiographical impulse. And yet, how does Franklin begin? Dear son. I love that opening. Of course, American literature has cornered the market on great openings. You don't know about me unless you read a book by Mark Twain called Tom Sawyer, and off we go. Call me Ishmael, and off we go. These magnificent openings. Dear son. It is, of course, a letter from a father to a son. To what purpose do fathers write to their sons? To show affection, to instruct, to guide, to correct. And this tells us less about Franklin the author and more about those whom he wishes to aid. And as we spend time with the autobiography and spend time with Franklin, at a certain point we realize we are all the sons of Benjamin Franklin. I think he realizes he is writing to posterity. Franklin had a very keen understanding of his place in history. And this is part of what I mean by Franklin's influence on American culture and the American character. Again, all being the sons of Benjamin Franklin, nobody more so than those who chafe against that. The other inducements that he mentions here. He says, it may be agreeable to you to know the circumstances of my life. This is an example that he wants to be imitated. He does think that he has done some things well. And this comes across, it always seems to me, less as prideful, look how well I did, and more as, I'm sharing this with you so that you can avoid some of the errata of my life. And so that you can have a more successful, a more useful life than you might have otherwise. He will emphasize his rise from poverty and obscurity. And this is part of what he means when he says, my situation is fit to be imitated. This is one of the first versions of what we now call that Horatio Alger story, that rags to riches story. Franklin does not come from that sort of Eastern patrician background of a Jefferson or a Washington. Comes from a very different place, a much more ordinary place. And in that sense, it is a life that most of the rest of Americans have far more purchase on that life than they do in let's call it the American aristocratic lives. He says he wants to correct some faults. And again, this is sort of that Puritan impulse at moral perfection, yeah, but it also is an admirable moral impulse to reflect on one's life and try to do better in an almost workmanlike way. And then, of course, he admits, there's some vanity to this. And of course, this is the disarming nature of Franklin's style. As I'll say a bit more about this, if you admit that you're vain, you come across as far less vain than the person who does not. And he's really good at this. To embrace one's vanity actually lessens one's vanity. He says on the second page, most people dislike vanity in others, whatever share they have of it themselves, but I give it fair quarter wherever I meet with it, being persuaded that it is often productive of good to the possessor and to others that are within his sphere of action. And therefore, in many cases, it would not be quite absurd if a man were to thank God for his vanity among the other comforts of life. And then, almost as an afterthought, and now I speak of thanking God, I desire with all humility to acknowledge, and he goes on to say that, I had some blessings from God, and that was helpful. So there is a religious impulse in the autobiography, and I'll talk a bit more about this tomorrow. At times, Franklin wants to cloak the religious impulse. At other times, he wants to feature it. But the more Franklin puts his own life forward, I would argue, the more we see that it is not for the purpose of extolling his own life, but rather the impulse is to give, is to instruct, is to help, is to guide. So I buy the Franklin pose. I accept, more or less uncritically at the end of the day, the pose of a letter from a father to a son. Now, today I want to talk, the autobiography is divided into 4 parts. I'm going to dwell mainly on the first part today and then talk more about parts 2, 3, and 4 tomorrow. So what does he emphasize early on in the autobiography? He starts with the example of his parents, the excellent constitution of his mother, the work ethic of his father, the gravestone that Franklin himself inscribed. They lived lovingly together in wedlock. By constant labor and industry, with God's blessing, they maintained a large family comfortably. From this instance, reader, be encouraged to diligence in thy calling and distrust not providence. Now that's anti-puritanical. The Puritan gravestone would read, it would be the memento mori, the reminder of your death. Look upon this death and know you're going to die very soon too. Franklin doesn't go there. Be diligent in thy calling and distrust not providence. He talks about trying poetry at an early age and realizing, no, that's not for me, and turning instead to prose. Franklin is a literally prosaic person. He is a man of prose, and I'll talk a bit more about his writing style. He talks early on about his embrace of the Socratic method, and this I think is very important. He comes across this in a book of rhetoric. I mean, this is back in the days when rhetoric was taught. The writing course that we talked about used to be called rhetoric, the art of persuasion. And he says, read about the Socratic method, and he said, I was charmed with it, adopted it, dropped my abrupt contradiction and positive argumentation, and put on the humble inquirer and doubter. So this becomes his approach in all things. He says, this habit, I believe, has been of great advantage to me when I have had occasion to inculcate my opinions and persuade men into measures that I have been from time to time engaged in promoting. And as the chief ends of conversation are to inform or be informed, to please or to persuade, I wish well-meaning, sensible men would not lessen their power of doing good by a positive, assuming manner that seldom fails to disgust, tends to create opposition, and to defeat every one of those purposes for which speech was given us, to wit, giving or receiving information or pleasure. For if you would inform, a positive dogmatical manner in advancing your sentiments may provoke contradiction and prevent a candid attention. If you wish information and improvement from the knowledge of others, and yet at the same time express yourself as firmly fixed in your present opinions, modest, sensible men who do not love disputation will probably leave you undisturbed in the possession of your error. And by such a manner you can seldom hope to recommend yourself in pleasing your hearers or to persuade those whose concurrence you desire. Oh, the things we could say in our current age, in our current state of public and civic discourse. Our previous president, Ken Ruscio, was eloquent about the aims of a liberal arts education being to create good citizens and civil discourse, by which he didn't mean like well-mannered or something. He meant engaged in the process of civic endeavor and the civic good, the good of the commonweal. And that is a Franklin-esque spirit. I'll say no more about that right now. Other things in the autobiography, the do-good letters, his first sort of public writing effort, when he poses as Mrs. Silence Dogood, a middle-aged widow, and uses it to write these sort of satiric views of colonial America, talking about the challenges of hoop skirts, which my students don't know what on earth we're talking about with hoop skirts, and arbitrary government. Even then, he's talking about some of these great political questions. It's the style of genial instruction, comic instruction, but also what a fascinating writing project to take on the young man taking on the persona of a middle-aged colonial widow. This is somebody who can take on other personae. This is somebody who has the empathy to inhabit another person's worldview, to walk a mile in their shoes. I think there's something, again, very Franklin-esque about this first writing project. He talks about that initial conflict with his brother and the reasons why he leaves home. And this, I think, is important. Franklin does not want to come off well in that particular story. He justifies the reason he leaves, and we can see that his brother was envious and petty and a bit tyrannous. But he says, it was not fair in me to take this advantage, when he kind of manipulates his way out of the articles of indenture, of apprenticeship rather. He says, this I therefore reckon one of the first errata of my life. He says, perhaps I was too saucy and provoking. So, family dissension is not something that Franklin is proud of. He then mentions a book. Several times he mentions a book. It's an old book. It's a 17th century book, Pilgrim's Progress by Bunyan. And he says that he was influenced by that book early on, and then he says that he came across it early on in his journey to Philadelphia. It proved to be my old favorite author Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. It says, finely printed on good paper with copper cut. He's already got an eye for a well-made book. That's one of the many reasons to love Benjamin Franklin. He says, I've since found that it has been translated into most of the languages of Europe, and suppose it has been more generally read than any other book except perhaps the Bible. And this was true up to about the 20th century. Pilgrim's Progress was the most printed book other than the Bible in the English language. Honest John was the first that I know of who mixed narration and dialogue, a method of writing very engaging to the reader, who in the most interesting parts finds himself, as it were, brought into the company and present at the discourse. Defoe in his Crusoe, his Moll Flanders, Richardson in his Pamela have done this. So he knows that Bunyan is an early form of that 18th century genre, the novel. And he knows that he himself is drawn to that kind of work, to the telling of a tale through the novel. And of course, Franklin himself is on a pilgrim's progress, not for the New Jerusalem or for salvation in a spiritual sense as in Bunyan's work, but it's a secular version of that effort. And if you want to understand the 18th century novel, you got to read Franklin's autobiography, because in a way he is novelizing his own life story, making of himself a character in that first-person form that is so successful in the 18th century novel. Now, one of the great moments is the entry into Philadelphia. This is on page 18 in the Dover edition that you have, and I'm going to spend a moment on this. This is a passage of immense importance to American literature, and Franklin is riffing in that delightful American way on a tradition in the British novel. The entry into London, the entry into the city, is a classic moment that we get in the British novel all the way through to the present day. You see it in Dickens, you see it in all the 18th century novels. It is a secular version of Christ's entry into Jerusalem the week before of the Passion narrative. And here Franklin is doing his American version. I have been the more particular in this description of my journey, and shall be so of my first entry into that city, that you may in your mind compare such unlikely beginning with the figure I have since made there. He reverses the Christ metaphor. Christ enters Jerusalem in triumph, and a week later he will be crucified. Franklin enters in hunger and penury, but by the end he will be elevated as the favorite son of Philadelphia. Let's see, as in my working dress, dirty from my journey, I knew no soul, nor where to look for lodging. I was fatigued with traveling, rowing, and want of rest. I was very hungry, and my whole stock of cash consisted of a Dutch dollar and about a shilling in copper. The latter I gave the people of the boat for my passage, who at first refused it on account of my rowing. But I insisted on their taking it. This is very American. I'm paying my way. Insist on their taking it. And then, I love this, a man being sometimes more generous when he has but a little money than when he has plenty, perhaps through fear of being thought to have but little. And Franklin always, it's part of the charm of the narrative. Just when he's saying something where he comes off really well, he kind of undercuts it. There's a modest element to his style. He then, he asks the kid, hey, where'd you get that bread? And then he goes to a baker. He gave me accordingly 3 great puffy rolls. I was surprised at the quantity, but took it, and having no room in my pockets, walked off with a roll under each arm and eating the other. This is comic. This is sort of there's a sort of buffoon quality to this, and yet it's so charming, it's so disarming, and there's a kind of a devil may care. I look kind of ridiculous. I don't care. And there's a real kind of American quality to that. Walks past my future wife's father. She saw me, thought I made a most ridiculous appearance. Then he gives the other 2 rolls to a woman and her child that came down the river in the boat with us and were waiting to go farther. This act of charity and of generosity. Then I was led into the great meeting house of the Quakers near the market. I sat down among them, and after looking round a while and hearing nothing said, of course a Quaker meeting it goes on in silence, being very drowsy through labor and want of rest the preceding night, I fell fast asleep and continued so till the meeting broke up, when one was kind enough to rouse me. This was therefore the first house I was in or slept in Philadelphia. This becomes a kind of classic passage in American literature, and the importance of the urban space, which is one great vein of American literature, particularly in Irish American writing, Jewish American writing, Italian American writing, those great migrations into the cities, and talking about the desperate straits with which they grappled with American urban reality. Beginning in those ghettos, and then gradually working their way, Franklin-esque, into a place in American society, into a status and a sense of belonging. What sustains Franklin in these early chapters? His love of reading, his love of books, his being an educated man. How many times does he meet a person of relative power and prestige who finds out that Franklin reads books, and they instantly bond over this common interest in the printed word? His trade. Everywhere he goes, he can find work because he's so good at running a printing press. And then, of course, the way he carries himself, the relative humility, the unassuming quality. You know, there's I'll talk more about this tomorrow. There's a great moment in C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, where Lewis is talking about that Christian virtue of humility. And he says, we really misunderstand humility. It has nothing to do with a sort of craven, sniveling, oh, I'm so humble. He says, if you really meet a truly humble person, you'll come away thinking, boy, they were really interested in me. Boy, I feel really smart around that person. Boy, they didn't talk much about themselves, but they really got me interested in them. And you actually feel, boy, that person is very confident. There's a kind of relationship between true humility and confidence that I think is very, again, very Franklin-esque. I think Franklin understood that. There are other marvelous moments early on. One of my favorites is when Franklin is in England, his first extended period in England, and he talks about beer versus water. And he says here, my companion at the press drank every day a pint before breakfast, a pint at breakfast with his bread and cheese, a pint between breakfast and dinner, a pint at dinner, a pint in the afternoon about 6 o'clock, and another when he had done his day's work. I mean, even Washington and Lee students are impressed with this degree of drinking. This is astonishing. Franklin, of course, says, I thought it a detestable custom, not out of a Puritan impulse that, drink is the devil's liquor and so forth. Nothing like that, but because it's bad for you. And what is really bad about drinking, it lessens your productivity and it eats into your wages. And he goes on to talk about how, they would borrow against their week's wages for this beer, and at the end of the week they go to the pay counter like the rest of us, and they're like 6 shillings short because they got to pay for all the beer that they have drank. So again, it's not really a moral argument, it's an argument of use and of productivity and of work. A similar one is, he talks a lot about swimming. Morgan makes this point early in the biography, is you got to keep in mind that the Franklin of his youth is not kind of the portly, stately guy. He was somebody who could swim 2 miles at a stretch, who could perform acrobatic gymnastic feats in the water. This too is kind of an American quality to it, this sort of lusty, athletic, outdoorsy kind of quality to Franklin. And then, of course, we get the return to Philadelphia, almost at the end of part 1, and the beginning of his public life. And this is really where Morgan's excellent biography begins. It doesn't really focus much on the first 20 or 30 years. In fact, all of a sudden, Franklin is 58 years old, and we're 30 pages into the biography. It's, what happened? Franklin tells his story a little differently. He wants us to see those early years and how he developed. Now, as I said, tomorrow I'll devote my second lecture to much more detailed consideration of the autobiography and the intellectual portrait of Franklin that emerges. I want to look at some key elements in I call it his intellectual structure, and some evaluation of this self-portrait and of Franklin's legacy for American letters. I want to talk about that tomorrow. But in the time I've got left today, I want to explore further how it is that Benjamin Franklin fits with his own contemporaries at this, as one of the fountainheads of American literature and American character. Because to a certain extent, it is with Benjamin Franklin that American literature is born. With Benjamin Franklin, American literature is born. The autobiography, the almanac, which I'll talk about briefly tomorrow, and some of the other writings. There are 3 great tributaries to the great river of American literature. And that river, of course, is the Mississippi. One we have already explored, the Puritan legacy, which, as I've indicated, is very much alive in the American character today. Great Alumni College program, the Puritan experience. Well, just planting a seed, something to think about.
Need some help marketing.
We really don't plan these. It just comes up. So we've explored that already. The second is the so-called colonial period, the era of Franklin and a few other mighty authors. And then the third is the early 19th century writers. Two strains in particular, James Fenimore Cooper and his great leather stocking novels. The 5 great novels of Natty Bumppo or Hawkeye or The Deer Slayer, absolutely fundamental to understanding the American character. This pathfinder figure who forsakes the growing civilization of the eastern seaboard and goes increasingly westward into the frontier, pushing the boundaries, going into that uncharted world. Cooper, and then the great slave narratives of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. You take those two pieces and you get early 19th century American writing. I'm putting aside Native American literature and writing and folklore and culture. That really is the fourth great tributary, but it has a very uneasy relationship to the other three. And we could talk at great length about the complexities of that. But from those, let's say those 3 sources I've listed, the Puritans, the colonial, the early 19th century, the iconic writers of the mid-19th century emerge. Thoreau and his magnificent Walden that continues to define the American character today. Hawthorne and his haunting novels like The Scarlet Letter, In the House of the Seven Gables, Melville with the magisterial Moby Dick, surely one of the great candidates for the great American novel. Emerson and his definitive essays like Self-Reliance and The Oversoul. And finally, Walt Whitman and his great poetic expression of the American character, Song of Myself. And if all goes according to plan, I'll finish tomorrow's lecture on Franklin with Walt Whitman, which is always a good way to both end and begin any understanding of America. Whitman. Oh, we could do a whole week on Walt Whitman. Great fun. So what do we learn about Franklin if we situate him with his own contemporaries, with these other great writers and thinkers who were engaged in creating an American literature at the very same moment that America itself was being created as a political entity, sometimes by the very same people. We think about Jefferson, who's sort of writing American literature and creating American government, with the same hand. Hence that invention of his, right? Where the first sort of copying invention. So 3 examples of this I want to talk about. J. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur and his fascinating work, Letters from an American Farmer, 1782, being written at the same time that Franklin is writing the Autobiography. Crevecoeur was French-born, emigrated first to England, then to Canada, then to upstate New York. He was a military surveyor and eventually settled into life as an American farmer and wrote a series of sort of essays or letters about his travels and experiences in America. And it came out in 1782, very successful, very popular, very, very much read in America and England. Actually, England really loved Letters from an American Farmer. They thought it was fascinating. And I'm just going to read a little bit from letter number 3, titled, What is an American? And just a couple of points that he makes. Crevecoeur says, talks about our dictionary, which is but short in words of dignity and names of honor. Not a titled aristocracy. We don't need names and titles for our concept of honor. We need few words for what we mean by honor. That's a telling sentence to speak on this campus, I will say. I will say with pride. He says, we are the most perfect society now existing in the world. Here man is free as he ought to be. Talking about the unknown bounds of North America. Who can tell how far it extends? Who can tell the millions of men whom it will feed and contain? A little echo there of that end of Gatsby. Talks about the American race. They are a mixture of English, Scotch, French, Irish, Dutch, German, and Swedes. From this promiscuous breed, that race now called Americans have arisen. Do you think that the monarchical ingredients which are more prevalent in other governments have purged them from all foul stains? In this great American asylum, the poor of Europe have by some means met together. 2/3 of them had no country. They are wretches who wander about. Now urged by a variety of motives, here they came. And then I'll close with this very famous paragraph. When he says again, what is the American? His country is now that which gives him land, bread, protection, and consequence. What then is the American, this new man? He is either a European or the descendant of a European, hence that strange mixture of blood which you will find in no other country. And it's going to get a lot stranger as the centuries go on. I could point out to you a family whose grandfather was an Englishman, whose wife was Dutch, whose son married a French woman, and whose present 4 sons have now 4 wives of different nations. He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. He becomes an American by being received in the broad lap of our great alma mater. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into 1782 are melted into a new race of men whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world. Americans are the Western pilgrims. I mean, he gets it, right? That is astonishing in 1782. This is definitive of the American character, the American promise, the American enterprise. But there are other sections I could read you where Crevecoeur is highly critical of the slaveholder and of slavery in American society. And his final 12th letter is very enigmatic. He writes from an Indian village while the Revolutionary War convulses the land. And there's a kind of flight into the natural world and into the world of Native American that is going to be very emblematic again for Cooper, for Thoreau, for Annie Dillard, for many American writers to come. So there's a powerful overlap between Crevecoeur's sensibility and writings and some of the things that Franklin was embarked upon. Jefferson, of course, only published 1 book, Notes on the State of Virginia. Oh, just an essential book for understanding the ways in which we conceive of the American landscape, both political and natural. Jefferson, of course, said he wanted to be remembered for 3 things. For writing the Declaration, actually many people wrote it, but he led that effort. For writing the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and for founding the University of Virginia. Boy, that sounds like Franklin, doesn't it? I want to be remembered for these great achievements that do not glorify me so much as they serve this great usefulness and purpose for the nation and for the nation to come. And the Declaration of Independence is essential to be taught in an American literature course. This recent book by Danielle Allen, one of the leading current American intellectuals, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality. Boy, that's probably the book I would most recommend to any American to read today. Absolutely magnificent book. We had every one of our first-year students last summer, we sent them this book and they read it. And then we brought Danielle Allen to campus to be our convocation speaker. And it was a magnificent enterprise. She wrote the book because when she was at the University of Chicago, she was teaching a night class, sort of continuing education, nurses, industrial workers, homeless people who wanted to move along in their education. And she taught a great books curriculum. She taught them Plato, she taught them Shakespeare, she taught the Declaration of Independence. And she realized that piece of writing is of such importance to America today. And so she spent 3 years writing a whole book about it. Notes from the State of Virginia, Jefferson's book, written 1781 to 1784. the Revolutionary War is going on, and Jefferson thinks it's important to write a book about the state of Virginia. And of course, I don't mean that to say, what was he doing? He should have been shooting a musket or something. No, he should have been bequeathing his wisdom of the American project to posterity as he has done. I'm just going to read one passage from this book, which is titled Natural Bridge. And he's talking about our natural bridge, which I think used to be part of the Jefferson estate. Didn't he own that land? Or yeah, I mean... So he says, the natural bridge, the most sublime of nature's works. And I'm just going to skip down a little bit, but he talks about standing there, and he says, the arch approaches the semi-elliptical form. Let me skip that. Though the sides of this bridge are provided in some parts with a parapet of fixed rocks, yet few men have resolution to walk to them and look over into the abyss. You involuntarily fall on your hands and feet, creep to the parapet and peep over it. Looking down from this height about a minute gave me a violent headache. This painful sensation is relieved by a short but pleasing view of the Blue Ridge along the fissure downwards and upwards. This is what has come to be known as the American Sublime, and the great Hudson River landscapes of the next century. And I've given you a few images of those in my presentation. They're great examples of the American sublime, this landscape that is so vast, that is so promising and yet frightening in its promise. That too is part of that great passage from the Great Gatsby. Dizzies the imagination even to contemplate it. And of course, so, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Mount Rainier was outside my window, 14,442 feet. Natural Bridge is like 100 feet. That's sublime? Go to the Rockies, go to the Cascades, you see sublime. But of course, it's everywhere in that American landscape, that idea of sublimity. Jefferson, of course, in the notes, he talks about freedom of religion and gives eloquent statement to the meaning and the importance of that. And I have to read his great passage on reason and free inquiry, because what he's talking about here is what we do every day at Washington and Lee University, a liberal arts education. It's a very short passage. He says, reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error. Give a loose to them, they will support the true religion by bringing every false one to their tribunal. To the test of their investigation, they are the natural enemies of error and of error only. And it seems to me that those principles have never been under greater duress than right now in 2018 from both sides of the political spectrum, in my view. All right, here endeth the sermon. It's all there in Jefferson's book: nature, humanity, the rights of man, the role of government, freedom of religion, dignity of labor, essential book for understanding the period. And then finally, Phyllis Wheatley, 1753 to 1784, a very short life, who published in 1773, on the eve of the Revolution, poems on various subjects, religious and moral. Phyllis Wheatley was born in Africa and brought to Boston as a slave when she was probably about 8 years old. She was taught to read and write. She soon was learning Latin, studying the Roman poets, learned the Bible intimately, as well as the great 17th and 18th century poets Milton, Gray, and Pope. Soon she was writing and publishing her own poetry, such as her famous elegy on the death of Reverend George Whitefield, the evangelist of the Great Awakening and friend of Benjamin Franklin. In 1773, she was brought to London with her manuscript of original poems. There she met with the Lord Mayor of London and with Benjamin Franklin, who met to show their respect. Her book was published in the autumn of 1773, but it required a preface, a testament of authenticity from leading white citizens in Boston, including John Hancock, to convince skeptical readers that a person of African descent could write poetry. This, of course, was one of the arguments of the 18th century in favor of slavery, that people of African descent were incapable of, and this is John Locke and David Hume that I'm referring to, were incapable of abstract mathematical reasoning, were incapable of creative enterprises like poetry and painting. These were some of the arguments that were put forth. Wheatley was a living refutation of those arguments. Her most famous, she was then freed that year. She married another free black man, and they lived a life of hardship and poverty. There was no employment for her. Her poetry is characterized by an extremely learned style, an earnest piety, its moral exemplar, and its admiration of heroic men, like her great poem, To His Excellency General Washington, which she sent to George Washington and which he acknowledged. Now, her most famous poem is on being brought to Africa from America. Very short. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train." Talked about how paradoxical American literature is, a very paradoxical poem. The simplistic reading, a sense of gratitude for being brought from Africa to America because that brought her to Christian theology and to salvation. And that's there. You know, whenever you have a paradoxical reading, you got to make sure and say, all strains are there. That strain is certainly there. But look what happens in the second 4 lines. There's a turn to this poem. It's a two-part poem. She quotes somebody for the purpose of refuting it. That's part of the refutation of those false Enlightenment arguments in favor of slavery. And then she instructs, remember, Christians, she's talking to white Christianity. The black enslaved person is instructing the supposedly superior, more learned, more enlightened white Christianity. That's a move of the trickster. That's a move where the superiority of the supposedly inferior is being asserted. That becomes the dominant mode in African American literature all the way to the present day. The mode of the trickster, from African American folklore like Burr Rabbit and Brother John, through the trickery of the slave narratives when Frederick Douglass tricks the white people into teaching him how to read so he can gain literacy and hence authority over his own story. The trickster figure in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. We could go on and on with these many examples. And the necessity of wearing the mask, to use Paul Lawrence Dunbar's great phrase. We wear the mask that grins and lies, he says in his great late 19th century poem. This is an assertion of superiority, or at least equality, under a guise of, let's call it humility. Henry Louis Gates, the great scholar of American and African American literature, says the birth of the Afro-American literary tradition occurred in 1773, when Phillis Wheatley published a book of poetry. In that same year, she meets Benjamin Franklin. They meet in London. He admired her work. There is something very illustrative for us in this. We are in 1773. The great testing of America is about to occur, when the Constitution has the opportunity to establish radical and true freedom, and we fail. I quote here from a James Madison scholar who writes, "The U.S. Constitution opens with a message of inclusivity, establishing justice and ensuring domestic tranquility for the people. However, it's what the famous preamble and indeed the rest of the document doesn't address that's more telling. The Constitution's authors leave out their vital distinction between person and property. And in doing so, they ultimately protect one of history's most oppressive institutions. The absence of slavery in the Constitution is one of the great paradoxes of our founding era. The framers were revolutionary thinkers who created what would become the first successfully functioning government by the people. Their ideas of fairness, justice, and individual rights are what many world leaders emulate today. Why then did so many brilliant minds pledge to be champions of individual rights on one hand, then, on another, allow human beings to be reduced to chattel? Good question, a paradox. So I want to close with this image and this concept of what Ralph Ellison, the great African-American novelist and essayist of the 20th century, calls the American contradiction, the great gap between America's magnificent promise and its failure to fulfill that promise. I'm not just talking here about slavery and the Constitution. Go back to the Puritan promise and that passage from The Great Gatsby. America always over-promises and then fails to deliver on that promise. Yet Americans never stop believing in the promise. There's something magnificent about that stubbornness in the American contradiction. Here, in the very heart of this period, we see Benjamin Franklin. He is everywhere. He defines the period, perhaps nowhere better than in his recognition of poetic genius in Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved person. In this realization, Franklin reveals his fundamental humanity, which is likely the defining trait of Benjamin Franklin. Thank you so much. So we have a few minutes for questions and comments. Anything at all? Yes, sir.
Did Franklin have any writing mentors or teachers?
What a great question. Did he have writing mentors or teachers? He did not have formal teachers in that way. You know, he had his education, such as it was going to go into the ministry, his father couldn't pull that off. So he wasn't, like he was taught how to read, write, and to some extent how to think. What he really somehow learned was how to learn. And so he could pick up any author, any book, any text, as he says in those early pages of the autobiography with the Socratic method, for example, and teach himself what it meant and how to emulate that. So we'd have to ask somebody who knew more about the real details of those early years. But as far as I know, there was no great teacher who instructed him in his own writing style. He developed that himself, which is another American element, the American original. In a lot of ways, that Franklin, like Twain, like Faulkner, is in that mode. Yeah. Oh, Vicki and then Harry.
In the poem, The Weekly Coin, at the very end it said, reference Cain. Was that a reference to the biblical Cain and Abel?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, so there was a long-standing misreading of Genesis 4, that when Cain is cast out, the African peoples descend from Cain. And so that was sort of a biblical, a false biblical interpretation of a justification of slavery. So she's riffing on that. You know, this is signifying in the African American tradition before that tradition even begins. She's very subtle what she was able to do. Yeah.
At some point he mentions how picking up the essays of Addison and Steele and rewriting them, putting them in and reading them, and then going over and and then comparing the two results,
right,
turning one into poetry and then back into poetry. So that was his tutor in a way.
Exactly. Yes, he learned from other writers, and that method, copying out the great writers. That's how we used to teach how to write, and there's much to be said for that. I remember copying out a passage from Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and being profoundly discouraged and realizing I was never going to write anything like that. But that's okay. If I fall short of Joyce, I'm doing all right. Yes, sir.
I've always taken the Founding Fathers to be sons of the Enlightenment, realizing that, if in fact that is true, realizing that isn't their blinders towards slavery somewhat explicable? It just wasn't in their hard drive.
Yeah, I think that's a very compelling argument. You know, I think absolutely. And always have to be careful of not reading back and projecting our worldview onto the past, particularly if we're trying to blame, which is usually an effort to assert our own moral standing through critiquing theirs. And I'm thinking here, I was trying in my own comments not to blame, but to point out where these fissures arise in the American project. Because yes, like so many Enlightenment thinkers, they inherited this tradition of slavery, concept of slavery, and justification of slavery. At the same time, they break free and make these eloquent statements, what Ellison referred to as those documents that Ellison would cling to and say, that is, at the end of Invisible Man, he said, it's the principle we must remain true to, not the failures. And it's that great achievement. And they were somehow able to do that, and yet by breaking out of the constraints into which they were born. It's a remarkable story. Yeah, I think that's quite good.
What's the name of the book on the Declaration of Independence?
It's by Danielle Allen, and it's called Our Declaration. Our Declaration. Yes?
I find this concept of the trickster so fascinating. I'm not familiar with it, but I identify with that. I started out as a young attorney when there were very few women. And looking back in terms of how I survived that, it's sad.
Oh, man.
And it was interesting, I'm sure many other women of that generation did that, but the current generation doesn't, I don't think. They attack it more head on. It's a very interesting change in the generation.
Trickery is what those who are disempowered resort to and able to become empowered.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. Women have known this time out of mind. My mom and dad were great ballroom dancers, and one day they explained to me the concept of leading from behind. They said, this is something that great women dancers know. When you have a male partner who's not gifted, you lead from behind, and boy, he thinks he's a great dancer. And that's the trickster figure. The trickster is often working for the good of all, but in desperate situations has to do that for himself. The Irish know about this from 7 centuries of oppression by the British. The leprechaun is a trickster figure. Any oppressed society is gonna furnish tricksters. Yeah.
Mark, there's a new book that Mary Jane gave me for Christmas. It's by Jill Lepore, head of the history department at Harvard.
Right.
It's hundreds of letters that Franklin wrote his sister Jane. A few of the letters she wrote him back, but there's a lot of insight into his commentary on how things are going in the world in America in these letters. And,
Wow.
I recommend that to anyone who really cares about Franklin.
Fantastic.
I do too.
Great
I
recommendation.
read that.
Thank
And
you. Isn't it
it's
great?
fantastic, especially from women.
Now, see-
It's
Okay.
a social history. I learned some
Mark,
more. Have you read it?
That's a mother's milk of being right, confirmation.
Well done. Well, I see Rob is standing. What do we have next, Rob?
It's painful always to interrupt the discussion, but we have to move on to our photographs and then the break. Mark will be with us throughout the morning and through lunch for further discussions.
Indeed.
But please, for now, let's follow Tracy down the steps. We're going to have a 30-minute break back here at 10:45.